Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of a very deep dive in biodiversity credits. I am very lucky to have here with me three amazing experts who are going to help us understand more about this, some would say, complex topic of biodiversity credits. We know that there have been increasing efforts in the past couple of years to materialize this whole biodiversity credits idea, especially under international biodiversity targets and especially through market-based approaches. But at the same time, we've seen quite a big rise of advocacy against this term and advocacy against this activities, let's say. So we are here today to explore with experts that are working with local communities, experts that have quite a lot of knowledge from an academic and research background, and experts that have a lot of knowledge on the ground on the impact of biodiversity credits on local communities, on indigenous peoples, on landscapes, and overall explore, is it something that actually can work? So I'm very happy to have here with me today three amazing experts, as I said. First of all, I have here with me a very friend of mine from the Global Youth Biodiversity Network and an amazing scientist as well, Mirna Fernández, who is also a researcher in the Third World Network. I'm very, very happy to have here with me Sophus to Ermgassen, I hope I didn't kill this name, who is a researcher at the University of Oxford Nature Positive Hub. And I'm also very happy to have here with me Hanieh Moghani, an expert member and vice chair on the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and a senior legal advisor at Senesta and a member of the ICCA consortium. Welcome, everyone. Very, very excited to have you all here with me. And let's dive right into it and start with you, Mirna. So my first question to you and for our audience and for those who do not know anything about that is if you can explain in simple words, what is biodiversity credits?
Sure. Very happy to be here. Thanks, Irene, for the invitation. And well, as far as I know, there is not yet an universally agreed definition on biodiversity credits. So I cannot provide a definition that everybody will approve. So I will say how I understand it. I understand that biodiversity credits are, I would say, a not so innovative biodiversity finance scheme. And it consists of quantifying biodiversity gains or conservation or biodiversity action in general to put it into a quantity that can be equivalent to a monetary value, which can be purchased or traded afterwards or not, in theory. In practice, most of the times it would be used for some sort of purchasing or trading purposes, which is something that we call offsetting. It is a market-based approach, which means it is an approach that works based on how the market works, offer and demand, and exchange is based on that. And they are supposed to help raising finance and to fill the huge gap that we have in biodiversity finance, because we have a lot of money that is needed to address the biodiversity crisis that we're facing right now, and there are very little finance commitments. So that is why biodiversity credits now are a very trending topic, because there are high expectations that this mechanism would help a little bit to bring more biodiversity finance that is so needed in these years.
Thank you, Mirna. And I wonder, since you said there is no definition, there is no universally accepted definition, if there is something, Hanieh or Sophus, you would like to add in Mirna's definition, something that maybe in your understanding is different, or is this an agreed definition, at least for this group? I see a thumbs up from Sophus. So I guess from Hanieh as well, if she doesn't want to add anything. So this is the, let's say, definition you're going to be operating with for this conversation. Thanks, Mirna, for setting that.
I just want to add something. Sorry. I just want to add something. I completely agree what Mirna said. Just to add something, when we are going to define a term or a word, we should also look at where these words coming from. And as Mirna said, it doesn't come from people or grassroots people themselves. It comes from some other people who are making credits from biodiversity, and it all appears from the wording, what and which words we are using for showing some criteria and some part of our I just want to say it is very important to look at the wording of some terms and some words.
Thank you, Hanieh. And of course, it's important to see where terms are coming from and who is using those terms and why. And since you already got the floor, the next question is for you. And we heard Mirna saying that this is a market-based approach. So I just want to ask you, Hanieh, if you think in general that market-based approaches can indeed support solving environmental problems. Can you maybe share any ethical considerations that might exist around commodifying nature, commodifying ecosystems through market-based mechanisms like biodiversity credits?
Actually, let me answer to this question in another way, and to talk about the very basic things which is related to this question. When it comes to stakeholders who are talking about making some solutions, of course, we are accepting all the stakeholders to be part of this solving some problems and making solutions. But as we are talking about this specific issue, and as it relates to making credits of something, and as all of us know that this term comes from markets and that part of stakeholders, we should also consider the roots of these kind of solutions, which in my point of view, it all relates to the model and the form of colonization. And I think even now we are facing a very secret model of colonization, which is it is somehow a routine in our life, which is a modern model of colonization. And I think even by making these kind of terms and these kind of wording, you can find and we can find these model and these mainstream of colonization. And I don't think that a group of people, a group of stakeholder who we know that they are the source of problem making, they can also solve that problem themselves. And I think there should be another agenda, another group of a stakeholder that should be the source of these problem solving.
Thank you, Hanieh, and thank you for boldly bringing colonialism and colonization and green colonialism in this conversation. Then I'm going to move the floor to you, Sophus, and I would love to hear from you, of course, if you have anything else to add to what you've already heard, but also one can only, especially a non-expert like me, when hearing biodiversity credits, I immediately think of carbon credits, which are also the more famous, let's say, ancestor probably of this one, as we've heard quite a lot of it, also especially this in the last year in mainstream publications around carbon credits. So I wonder, are the same ways that carbon credits can be manipulated or misused? Is this a concern also for biodiversity credits? Are there safeguards being in place for biodiversity credits? Have we learned our lessons from carbon credits?
Nice. Yeah, really wonderful set of questions. And thanks so much for the nice introduction of both the other speakers as well. So I think the first step here is to say that biodiversity credits, the way that I define it in the academic literature, it's not really considered just one thing. It's Mirna's definition, really nice, that it's a kind of commodified increase in biodiversity in some form. But we have lots of different policies across the world that trade so-called credits as biodiversity offsets. Offsets can be considered a kind of a subset of credits that are there to compensate for a loss elsewhere, whereas other forms of credits are not compensating for losses. So you've got a whole bunch of things, and these credits all work in different kinds of ways. So there are some that absolutely do replicate problems that we've seen in the voluntary carbon market. There are some that don't necessarily do this, but they have other kind of problems, or they face other kinds of challenges. So if we think about the kind of the state biodiversity offset systems, for example, in Australia, which they call credits, right, where you're trading credits, and in fact, some emerging biodiversity credit methodologies are based on these government policies, these offset calculation methods used in government policies. Then they face some of the same problems. They're based on making assumptions about how the biodiversity will change at the start of the project, like upfront, and then they kind of don't check whether or not those assumptions are real based on real data over time. And so you get all the same problems that you get in the voluntary carbon market of the ability to potentially game your counterfactual. So game how many credits you get by overestimating how much deforestation would have occurred in the absence of your investment, for example, which is one of the main fundamental problems in the voluntary carbon market. I mean, the main problem with any of these kind of credits, right, is if you're buying something and you use it to make a claim that you're achieving some kind of biodiversity improvement or that you're achieving some kind of nature positive outcome, and that claim is not real, then that's a real problem. It creates the illusion of action, the illusion of success without actually materializing. So we basically want, in my view, we want scientifically rigorous credits that deliver the thing that they say that they're delivering, and we don't want credits that are not delivering the thing that they say that they're delivering. Others totally get around these problems of counterfactual estimation in the voluntary carbon market by not having any kind of counterfactual at all. There are some credits that just use a theory of change. So they say we measure biodiversity beforehand, we measure biodiversity afterwards, and we have a detailed theory of change so that we say that the improvement in biodiversity is because our theory of change is dealing with the drivers of biodiversity loss in the area. So that's a way of overcoming the counterfactual problem because you don't even try to estimate the counterfactual. Other kind of credits use habitat banks. So that means they deliver the biodiversity increases before they sell them, at least in theory. That's how habitat banks are supposed to work, but in reality, it varies across the world. And that's also quite a nice way of getting around some of the problems in the voluntary carbon market because you can deliver the stuff beforehand, so you don't worry about not delivering it in the future, which is what happens when it's based on an upfront projection. So there's just some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Sophus, and thanks to all of you for sharing your initial thoughts. And I do have one question, and then I think I would love for us to try, well, because what I'm listening from all of you is that there is not a universal definition. There are many different definitions at the moment, and there are also many different ways these biodiversity credits are materializing, some of them following the issues that come also from the carbon credit space, some of them following the issues that come with colonialism, neocolonialism, green colonialism, etc. And there seems to be all this diversity of approaches. So I'm really wondering how, this is being dealt under the blanket biodiversity credits that sometimes you're listening in international agreements. But my next question actually is, I'd love for me to know, and also for our audience to know, what are the social and economic impacts that Mirna and Hanieh as well, I guess, have you seen from biodiversity credits or carbon credits? But let's focus on biodiversity credits. When projects like that are implemented, what is the economic or social impact that has been put on communities, and what are the main concerns that indigenous peoples or local communities or people living in a landscape have put forward in regards to biodiversity credits projects. And let's start with you, Mirna. Beautiful.
But well, when it comes to impacts, social and economic impacts, I think that Hanieh will share more on the ground examples, but actually the impacts from carbon credits and biodiversity credits will be a bit similar. Especially when it comes to the credits that are related to offsetting, because as Sophus explained it, not all the credits in biodiversity are supposed to be meant for offsetting, but the ones offsetting will create these impacts that are related to the whole offsetting process and the offsetting scheme. That has huge ecological impacts, because then you are justifying or making room for further destruction and of the environment and all the people and the communities that depend on the environment. So you have all the impacts that are coming with this further ecological destruction that you're justifying with the offsets in one side, but in the other side, you have to, in theory, create some sort of biodiversity gain in the case of biodiversity credits, right? Or in the case of carbon credits, it would be some sort of carbon sequestration or the protection of carbon sinks. And then because you need to demonstrate that this is happening, sometimes this will conflict with the economic activities, for example, of indigenous peoples and local communities. So they would be displaced from their homes, or they would be prevented to do the activities that they would do if it is harvesting or it's related to something with the forest products. So there is a lot of displacement of indigenous peoples and local communities that we saw during the implementation of the carbon markets. And there are already some examples of displacement of indigenous communities that are coming from the implementation of biodiversity credit projects. It is proved already that projects that are involved in offsetting also have some of them high levels of violence or increased violence in the communities, and also the access to economic resources or the economic alternatives that they have will be different, because then they will have some restrictions, because in the end, what matters the most is to demonstrate that you have this gain in biodiversity or in carbon sequestration. There should be safeguards for this, but it is very difficult to agree on safeguards and also to make sure that these safeguards are applied, and that free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples and local communities is really put in place, so they know the potential impacts before accepting one of these projects in their lands. But I am sure that Hanieh will come with more examples about this.
Thank you, Mirna, for setting the scene for that. Hanieh, would you like to add something on what Mirna said?
Just a very short adding, and thanks to Sophus for raising the issue of theory of change. I just want to add that before having this term, we had a very more proper term about access and benefit sharing, which is already in Nagoya Protocol. And we all are aware about what is mentioning in Article 8J of Convention on Biodiversity Conservation. So at that article and at that protocol, we were talking always about access and benefit sharing, but I don't know how it shifts to biodiversity credit. And you can see how these kind of terming are manipulated by the mainstream. Because before that and under the theory of change, we were always discussing about who is really conserve biodiversity, and we all are aware about by the statistics that indigenous peoples and local communities together are conserving 80% of the existing biodiversity in our world. So, but when it comes to referring to money and money making, or translating it to money, everything changed. And before that, we always talked about access and benefit sharing. Yes, we couldn't access to any criteria for benefit sharing, because you can see how these kind of practices are manipulating by markets and other people who are not conserving, not just not conserving biodiversity, but they are the main source of biodiversity loss. So in this regard, unfortunately, just pointing out what you mentioned in your question, there is no success story relating to gaining these credits by the grassroots people. And not just this one. The other thing that we are seeing that it is trend nowadays is direct access to finance. Even indigenous peoples and local communities, they have to obey what is mentioning by the fundraisers and what is their agenda for biodiversity conservation, although they do not anything, not just, I cannot say anything, but maybe they are not as much aware as indigenous peoples and local communities. We had a discussion, and in our language, we are using so many simple words like Pachamama, Mother Earth, and these things. Although other people maybe use these wording, but I think they are pretending that they know what is it exactly. But people who are knowing the exact value of biodiversity, I think they should also make decision about how they are going to even credit biodiversity, although I'm not agree with this wording, but how to conserve it and by what and which way they are going to conserve biodiversity.
Thank you, Hanieh. Thank you so much for sharing this, and thank you also for kind of giving me the perfect way to go to the next question and continue this conversation, because you mentioned that according to your knowledge, of course, there is no successful implementation of any of these schemes, one at least that indeed serves what is needed from the local community, the people that live in the certain area. And also you brought up a very important point on finance and direct finance, and to what extent the people that actually have the knowledge of the landscape are being listened when it comes to restoration and conservation. So thank you for bringing those. And I'd love to bring this next question then to Sophus, because Sophus, you mentioned before, that there is a very big and diverse approach to biodiversity credits. There are different models. So I'm curious from your research, is there any of these models that is attempting to put something in place that could, to an extent, be indeed supportive to the people that live in the landscape, to indigenous peoples, to local communities? And I'm asking that because in the last conversation we held with representatives from the markets, they were quite insistent that there are these examples, and there are examples where people are being supported. So I'm really, really curious if you have encountered any.
No, this is such a critical question. Yeah, I mean, the way I think about this in my work and with a lot of my colleagues as well is, biodiversity credits are right on the cusp. Basically, if done badly, then they can be yet another form of neocolonialism that propagates existing inequities, that purchases embodied land and materials, and biodiversity from the global south and appropriates them for the purpose of the global north, or with appropriate safeguards that are really well applied, and I'd say going beyond free, prior, and informed consent, and actually with indigenous-led projects that seek to access the global north finance then these things can kind of work in the opposite direction. They can be a redistributive mechanism from the north to the south, at least in theory. And that's the dream, right? That's the dream. That's the thing that we're trying to design here. If we accept that biodiversity credits is something that we want to upscale, we need to absolutely make sure it's not just a propagation of neocolonial principles, but it's actually something that is reparative in nature. Now, yes, we know that there are an awful lot of people who are talking about implementing biodiversity credits with effective benefit sharing schemes with high levels of revenue redistribution models. I've never seen or worked with any of them in practice, but I know that there's a lot of people who are thinking about this and a lot of people who are trying in various little experiments around the world. But I absolutely cannot comment on how successful they're being. So I really don't know. I think another thing that I've noticed in my work is we are at least well ahead of where carbon was when they were also an emergent industry, right? So the voluntary carbon market emerged a couple of decades ago. And I'd say, lots of discussions about human rights implications or social implications of the carbon credit industry only emerged many years after they started. Whereas at least we're thinking about this stuff earlier because we've learned, at least rhetorically, we have learned some of the lessons from the voluntary carbon market. And I think it's far too early to say yet whether or not we'll actually successfully address them. I don't know.
It's one of my favorite things when academics say, I don't know, because it's the most honest answer. So thank you so much for sharing that. And actually, thank you for painting clearly a picture that, yes, indeed, we might be ahead from carbon credits, but this doesn't mean that we are in a good place with this. And I think this actually reinforces what Hanieh just said. So Mirna, I'd love to come back to you for my next question and ask you if you think that, building on what we heard from Sophus and what we heard from Hanieh just now about how, yes, there might be intention and some points to indeed be better than what Carbon D has done so far, but we haven't seen very, very clear results in regards to successful implementation of biodiversity credits in regards to human rights or biodiversity outcomes. So I wonder if, from your knowledge and your experience so far, you've seen whether indeed the biodiversity credits market and bubble is currently taking all those concerns into consideration. Is there any work indeed being done from the people that really advocate for biodiversity credits to take into considerations the concerns that Hanieh brought up, to take into consideration the issues that Sophus brought up, and to ensure, that when we're working for biodiversity and we are working to increase the biodiversity finance, as you said, we are not perpetuating the mistakes from the past.
So what I was saying is that we're very advanced in the understanding, at least in the academic field, we are very aware of the risk and what should not be repeated. But there is a universe between our understanding in the academic and economist world and the world of the political view of policymakers. And that is the problem. And that is what we are worried about. An example from the carbon world, from the carbon markets world, when we had so much focus on the carbon, this was a problem because we didn't have the safeguards in place for indigenous peoples, local communities, for rights, for biodiversity. It was all about carbon. So we had these golf camps that got financed as carbon finance because they were made. I will put my video down because I think that the connection will be better. These golf camps got red funding because they were made with a specific kind of grass that was highly efficient, sequestering carbon. And then we had indigenous peoples and local communities that couldn't get this carbon red plus funding because they couldn't prove that their forests, they were sequestering the same amount of carbon. They couldn't measure the amount of carbon. And then we had this problem. Then to address these problems, we had the development of the RED plus safeguards that were really interesting, that talked about the indigenous people's engagement, about traditional knowledge, about ecosystems integrity, and they were really good. But the problem with that is that how they were implemented is that governments have to measure themselves and report how they are implementing the safeguards in order to get access to this RED Plus funding. And then we have a problem with self-monitoring and self-assessment. It is like if your mom travels away and tells you to give her every day a report on if you're taking care of the house and the dog and if you're doing your homework, you will give a message every day saying, I did everything perfectly, I'm doing fine, I am behaving correctly, even if you're throwing a party in the house with your friends, right? So that is the problem with the government as well. They will always report that they are doing everything correctly. And same happens with companies. Companies will hire the environmental engineers. I am an environmental engineer. I went through this. I was hired by companies that told me, please do the environmental impact assessment for us and say that nothing is being done in the wrong way and that we have all the permits to keep going. And if you cannot, there is like a queue of other professionals that will be very happy to sign these papers for us. So I think that the problem is that even if we have the safeguards and we have the understanding, the implementation will be a problem if we have self-monitoring, self-assessment, and we cannot really assess if this is being implemented in the correct way or not. And that is why I say I don't know, because there are many companies that are reporting enormous benefits, but we don't know if this is true. Who is evaluating them? Who is monitoring the real impacts?
Thank you, Mirna. I love the example of the house party and how we lie to our mothers about what we do with that. This is such an easy way for everyone to understand the issues of accountability and implementation when it comes to something that might look great on paper, but then what happens when you actually go out there and implement it? And I think this is actually a very great way to also go to the next question. And this is the year where we are going towards the 16th Conference of the Parties under the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. The agreement in the previous Conference of the Parties was celebrated as historic. Others called it just a perpetuation of what happened before. There are many, many views, but my question is specifically for biodiversity credits. And since we are seeing an increasing interest from businesses and countries on the biodiversity international political agreement. Mirna, what is your message to this upcoming, let's say, process that will lead to COP16? What is your expectation? What is your message in regards to biodiversity credits? And I'd love to also pass this question to the rest after you give us your first answer, as I know you've been very, very involved with this space through the Global Youth Biodiversity Network.
Well, from the youth, we have a very important message, a core message that is biodiversity is not replaceable. Ecosystems are not replaceable, and the people that depend on these are not replaceable. So even though there is a lot of hype around biodiversity credits, I think we cannot even start the conversation on how these schemes are going to be implemented if we don't have a conversation about the impacts, the safeguards, and real safeguards, because non-binding safeguards are a contradiction by itself. What are they going to safeguard? And if we cannot have this conversation, I would really go for options from indigenous voices that are calling for a moratorium on biodiversity markets. And if not, at least a moratorium on biodiversity credits that are not voluntary and that are mandatory and serve offsetting purposes, because we cannot really replace biodiversity once it's lost. And finally, these conversations about how we implement the global biodiversity framework should really be about addressing the drivers of biodiversity loss. Should be really about regulating the companies that are doing the most damage, about liability and redress to the communities that are most affected by these biodiversity harming activities. They should be about regulation for the companies and regulation mechanisms for the finance institutions so they don't give money to the wrong actors. And these biodiversity credits is a really, really small part of everything what should be done with regards to biodiversity and finance. So if we don't have these conversations that are crucial, first, how to direct the financial resources to the real actors on the ground, like indigenous peoples, local communities, women, youth, who are really working to safeguard the biodiversity that is remaining, then these all other little efforts to raise additional funding are meaningless and useless.
Thank you, Mirna, for painting a very clear picture and for bringing up also the perspectives of youth and the rest of the civil society that is involved in the Convention of Biological Diversity. Hanieh, would you like to add something on what Mirna said? What is your message to the process towards the upcoming COP16 for the Biodiversity Convention?
Yes, thank you. I think after almost more than 20 years, maybe it is near to 30 years, that our government ratified this convention. And now this is the time to do the practice in the ground, not just talking about how we are going to conserve these biodiversities and making these kind of terms like biodiversity credits and these things. You know, as I told before, Indigenous peoples, local communities, youth, women, they know the solution, but they have no ground to practice these kind of solutions because money is not in our hand. We cannot make decisions, and we cannot practice our indigenous and traditional knowledge in the ground. So I think and you know, the nature of biodiversity as it comes from the wording, it should be practicable in each place in regard to the need of that specific place and that specific area. So if they I don't know why we, after these many years, we are still saying to the parties to let us to be part of these decision making, although in some level they pretend that they are letting us to be part of decision making, but you know, one or two representative of indigenous people without any transparency, it is not enough to call it participatory decision making or something like that. But you know, if we can for example, conservation of biodiversity would be in our hand, I mean, in the hand of indigenous peoples and local communities who were the safeguard and pioneer for conserving biodiversity for thousands of years. Then we can show how we are going to do in the ground. And all of these things relate, and I think at least in this COP, in the upcoming COP, there should be some wisdom that indigenous peoples and local communities, at least for the sake of theory of change and all these things which are very theoretical, at least at this time, we should make it happen and let indigenous peoples, local communities, youth and women be part of these decision making. And I can assure you that after that, there would be a real theory of change in the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanieh. And I love how we're continuing to having some threads throughout this whole conversation, like the theory of change. Sophus, is there something you would like to add? What is, in your perspective, important in these upcoming policy processes, keeping in mind, of course, especially biodiversity credits and finance?
Yeah, awesome. Great questions, really great questions. I don't know, I think it's about proportionality. If I've been an academic working in this area for the best part of a decade, and I can see the rhetoric around these so-called novel financial instruments, many of which are derived from policies that have been around for 50 years. You know, the rhetoric around these things is really intensifying incredibly at the moment. But for a bit of perspective, the size of the voluntary carbon market after about 20 years of development is $2 billion. Whereas the size of the global biodiversity funding gap, it's estimated to be somewhere in like the $500 billion gap. We're talking about that if the biodiversity credit market upscales at a rate that's the same as the carbon credit market, then it's a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of the solution. And all of these kind of scientific assessments of the size of the biodiversity funding gap, they show that the major driver of the biodiversity funding gap remains completely perverse government subsidies that are incentivizing further environmental degradation. Right? If you want to address have the most impactful way of addressing the global biodiversity funding gap, you wouldn't work on private financial instruments at all. You would work on addressing government subsidy. And that's by far the most effective way of doing it. So I think that was my number one call is I think all sources of finance for biodiversity are welcome. I think those that are done well and that can, essentially act as a kind of redistribution, from either countries in the global north or institutions and corporations from the global north who have historically derived some of their revenues from the extraction of labor, materials, and biodiversity from the global south. Right? If we can create those mechanisms, that is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But if this becomes the whole conversation, it's completely neglecting what the real issues are. And in finance alone, the big issue is perverse subsidy. It's not a lack of private financial mechanisms. If you address perverse subsidy, you get most of the way to the problem. So I don't want biodiversity credits. I think it's absolutely essential that biodiversity credits does not preclude all of the important, fundamental actions that we have to take on other fronts. And that's one of my concerns right now, is the rhetoric is stealing so much policy attention that I think it's distracting from other stuff that's obviously much more fundamental.
Wow, Sophus, I feel we are closing this conversation with a bang with all of these points. And I see a heart from Mirna, and I saw that Mirna also opened her camera just to say yes to what she was listening. I think you all made wonderful points, and it's great that this conversation is moving also to the sphere of, okay, we are talking about solutions, but what about the drivers? We should not forget about those. Hanieh, please go ahead and add to what Sophus or Mirna said, or anything else you'd like to add.
Yes, I just forget to mention something, but Sophus just make it very clear. And I want to add, when it comes to financing and when it comes to direct access to finance, I just want to make a very simple example, because I am from Iran, and Iran is part of West Asia, so-called Middle East. And, when it comes to direct access to financing for biodiversity and these things, but there are so many other hidden obstacles and political barriers which are not seen in so many criteria. For example, it has been almost more than 30 years that not just my country, but all over almost 30 other countries which are under sanctions. And we know that biodiversity and it's and everything which relates to environmental and ecosystem issues have a butterfly effect. When you exclude part of the world, and I'm not advocating for governments or states. I am advocating for indigenous peoples and local communities who are the main safeguard of international biodiversity. And when you exclude indigenous peoples and local communities in almost 30 countries, just because of political issues which is not related to indigenous peoples and local communities, then how we are also talking about direct access to finance. And I think we should think more practical in this regard, and point out so many barriers which are man-made barriers. And the other thing that which is very, very, very related to biodiversity and biodiversity credit itself is armed conflict that we are facing. So when we are talking about all these issues, because you know I am indigenous, and because of the knowledge of my ancestor, I have to think holistically about everything, not just the one thing and one issue, because all of these issues are interrelated to each other. And when we are talking about these things, we also should address these man-made and political barriers, and how they are related to biodiversity conservation, and biodiversity credits. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hanieh, and thank you so much for actually taking the space to point out also to conflict and how it actually should be part of the discussion. Conflict, justice, peace, and all these relevant elements that you very nicely called man-made. I think, unfortunately, we reached the end of this discussion. I found it particularly interesting. I loved all the different threads that we carried with us until the end, from pointing out to the drivers, to direct access to finance, to who is actually stewarding the land, to the discourses of biodiversity credits and market-based approaches, and where these discourses are originating from, to academia actually knowing better this time around, but the gap that exists between this bubble and the political and market bubble. And also, of course, as we said now in the end, the very important aspect, probably a life-threatening aspect of conflict and war. Thank you all so much for coming to this space with a lot of knowledge and a lot of truth and boldness. I truly appreciate that. I'm sure the audience will also appreciate that. I guess we'll be seeing a lot from each other in the next coming months, as a lot of the biodiversity experts and people will be rallying up all the way to COP16. Have a wonderful day. Thank you to Mirna, who is actually in Nairobi for Substa at the moment, for taking a bit of time to join here. And thank you also to Hanieh for joining amidst a lot of political tension in the country. And thank you to you, Sophus. I'm sure you have a very busy program. So thank you for taking this Monday hour with me. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a wonderful day.